Hey everybody, it's that time of year again where I sit down with Kurt Cagle and Alison Morrison and we go through what we think might be in store for 2025 when it comes to data and knowledge graphs and AI and pretty much everything in between. And we've been doing this for quite a few years. It's sort of become a tradition. But if you are interested in what we've said in the past and see how well we did with our predictions, the link is down below for all the other videos. But if you want to see what we think might be going on for the next year, sure you stick around. Well, there's so much that's gone on this year. I mean, obviously, we'll talk about AI and how knowledge graphs are fitting into all of that because everyone else is talking about it. This morning, I saw it was either this morning or yesterday, Meta released that they're, doing this concept-based AI. And I'm like, neurosymbolic AI? What now? It's like, are we surprised? No. Is everybody else probably doing that? Highly suspicious, yes. Right? But let me ask you this question first. There's a lot of confusion, or maybe there's a lot of just discussion and nobody knows the right answer, so that could be true too. How is AI, as we know of it today, the generative AI, different than agent-based stuff? And is it the same thing? Because I've heard people talking about them as separate things. Some people are rolling them together. It's such a hype train right now. Who knows? Who knows what the right answer is? Maybe you do.
If you paint the picture of agents, and Kurt will know this too, you're going back 20 years or more. And there are companies in the web space. I mean, I'm thinking about enterprise web in particular, who've had agents in their platforms since the 2010s, since at least 2015. Yeah, what is new is the aspect of using agents in the context of generative AI and where the statistical AI is right now. And there's an interview on YouTube with Satya Nadella where he talks about the agent to agent vision that Microsoft has. And I don't know if you've seen that, but it's pretty recent. And so he's talking about the connections. Let's say you want to use SAP's data to help with what your agents are trying to do. So there are connectors between these enterprise suites, and Nadella's vision is that the agents would have access using similar connectors. And so the problem with those connectors is that they're point to point, and they reinforce the status quo in terms of software incumbency and the whole software wasteland that Dave McComb talks about. You're really just perpetuating the status quo. So I think there's a lot going on with agents, and it is the buzzword of 2024. And there's something to it. I mean, I did a piece on large action models a couple of months ago, and basically you've got this circumstance where you've got the UI and you've got the workflow, and you're trying to do what we used to call business process reengineering back in the day with the help of AI. And there's a power to that that's going to exist, and companies are trying to get their arms around it. But it's not like they're where they need to be with it by any stretch. And yet they will claim to be there. Some of them will claim to already be there. So just buyer beware kind of caveats when it comes to most of this stuff. There is a there, but I don't think most people know where that there is yet.
Well, a lot of it's aspirational, and oh my goodness, there's so many things to unpack from what you're saying. But before I dive into my points, Kurt, how do you think about this?
I would agree. I mean, I remember agents back, going back to the 80s, and the whole systems theory, notion of essentially autonomous systems communicating with one another. That to me has always kind of been the the vision I had when we started talking about agented systems is basically you have these autonomous nodes. And one of the problems that I see with that is that with the current systems as they exist, they're very centralized. We're still at a point, unfortunately, and I think that's changing. I think it's actually going to change pretty dramatically in 2025. But we're at a point right now where realistically, when we're talking about agents, it's still basically client server with a single central client. There's still a single big CPU there. It's just that we call it an LLM today. And those LLMs may be doing expert, MOE type work, but even given that, it's not something that you're talking about truly autonomous systems, and it's not something where you're basically saying, okay, I want to talk to A, then B, then C, then D, to be able to complete this process. That's really not that much different from working with web services architectures in general. But I think that right now, in agreement with Alan, I think it's much more buzzworthy to be able to make this all talk about these big centralized systems as being essentially independent agents, and they're not.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, my suspicion is that what we're going to see in 2025 is, and beyond, is actually a move towards increasingly distributed, increasingly decentralized systems. And those decentralized systems get a lot closer to what I would see as basically being truly autonomous, where your orchestration mechanism is essentially just one node in a process that's essentially saying, okay, can I do what we talked about, 12, 15 years ago with Hadoop, of essentially saying map reduce type operations to be able to get things done. And so, yeah, I think it's exciting, but it's not in any way, shape, or form all that novel. It just becomes, what does your endpoint look like?
Well, and that was one of the things that kind of spurred in my mind when Alan was talking is I may be controversial, maybe not, I don't know. Or maybe of course, Ashleigh, maybe it's a no-brainer.
Of course, Ashleigh.
Yeah, of course. I really think that there's a notion of the decrease of dependency of UX that's going to happen. Because what you're essentially talking about, make an API call, except you don't have to do any of that anymore, and you just have an agent, or you have different orchestration layers that are kind of doing the thing where it's connecting the things that needs to go together. And there's different pieces of data that can be shared across the board. I think that's the other thing that we're going to see is there's going to be this decrease of UX, where there's so much of the data and analytics and the processing of something, of a query, is on the back end of so much stuff on a UX. But I think you don't necessarily need a UX for many of these things now. And being able to just query with a prompt or whatever it is, even if you have a generic GUI, right, a generic UI, that's a lot of what you can see now, even in the knowledge graph community, where talk to your graph. You don't actually need to know all the queries. I mean, you do. Don't get me wrong, you do. That's the other thing. Is it there, or is it not there? That's another piece of that. But I see that trend is going to keep picking up steam, where it's well, wait a minute. Do we actually take your e-commerce site and all the different filters and all the different things? You can already see a lot of them are starting to hide all those things away. And a big reason for that is now if you have AI on top of it and you say, I want a woman, size 7, blah, 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 you're doing all the filtering in the query. It doesn't need to have all these filters and things on the UI anymore. It just can do it because it understands it, whereas it didn't before. So I think that's number one. But the there, I think that there's going to be this divergence. There's going to be, and it ties into the environmental impact of AI. I think people are going to start to pick up on the fact that it's incredibly expensive and overboard to use AI for some things, where today it's just so easy. Like, hey, I need to parse my query better in my search engine. Great, let's put an AI on it. Can you use a BERT model and it's half as expensive? That, right? Like, it's so easy to do right now because, oh, my engineers don't know machine learning or AI, but I can do a prompt and I can set all this stuff up. Great. But it's like, but is AI the right choice? Right? It's a tool, like any other tool. Is it right for the job? And I think a lot of people are going to start to realize that from a cost and an environmental standpoint, you can use other types of AI, other types of machine learning that are way more economic for what you're trying to do than the AI models that we have now. So they're there. I think you're going to start to see that getting a little squishy, right? Because people are going to,
or just direct retrieval. I mean,
or that.
Which Denny Brandici talks about, how cheap that is versus what we're looking at. And, you can sort of organize all these different modeling types in terms of complexity. And at the bottom, in terms of statistical modeling, is linear regression, which in itself is incredibly useful. So why would you use convolutional neural networks when you could use linear regression to answer?
Because the stakeholders want you to.
For now. So there is that.
Yeah.
But I also think, that there's also the aspect of governance. The moment that we get to the point where we're saying, yes, we're going to, move out of the UX realms. And I agree with you. I think that's happening. We're also basically losing oversight. We're losing the ability to see transactions. And unfortunately, one of the things that really, really scares me about once you start getting into agentic systems is that you don't know what's going on. You don't necessarily even have an API that's going on. You're really hoping that the prompt that you put in is sufficiently specified to make sure that it does in fact do what you want. And I think that to me is actually one of the areas where we get into these discussions about, well, we have these stochastic tools. Well, yeah, stochastic tools are great in certain circumstances. They're very good at being able to do confabulations. They're very good at being able to create things. They're not databases. And they are not
nor should they be.
Nor should they be. And I keep watching as all of these efforts are being made to say, okay, we have these things that are database like, and we are going to try to treat everything as a database, even though it's probably a bad idea. Just simply because, hey, look, we want to be able to justify those AI investments. And it's really, I think, beginning to finally percolate through the business community that maybe this isn't a great idea.
Yeah.
The areas where I think AI is really taking off are generally going to be areas that are where you are actually going in and trying to take advantage of the creativity, end quote, that is intrinsic with what a confabulator does. It's a very good lying machine. It's a very good machine at being able to create realities that don't necessarily exist. And you look at that in video, you look at that in music, you look at that in imagery. Those are perfect use cases for it, because in those cases, you're basically trying to fill in details that you wouldn't necessarily know, but that kind of make sense given the constraints of the prompts that you're putting in. And if you go in and do that recursively and iteratively, then you eventually get to where you want to be.
Well, and I
that's not a system, and it's not an agent.
I think that, and not to get into like the philosophy of things, but it kind of fits here a little bit. And I know you both kind of wax eloquently on things, so I know I'm in good company here where I get into some of these topics. But I've looked at this from a lot of different angles, and I myself have talked a whole lot about how do you understand the trustworthiness of name your thing, because in the type of industries that I work in, it's a lot of research-based stuff. And, if you can't trust that thing, then it's not useful and you can't trust it to do the next thing that you need to do.
You're sort of pointing to a cultural phenomenon, I think, actually, that may not have as much to do with AI as it does with maybe social media and the pervasivity of media, how pervasive media is, and so you're in a situation where there's this just a glut of quasi information out there that people are being exposed to, and they're not all versed in research methods and ferreting out the truth. And what tends to be amplified in a lot of cases is the noise rather than the signal. So we're getting buried in a lot of noise. And that's what's frustrating. And maybe we're blaming it on AI, but it's the totality of all of this stuff that, frankly, there's not a lot of data transparency in a lot of places. The data the data is the precursor. You need that data transparency. That's why we have the Financial Data Transparency Act. That's why banks and mutual fund companies and other FS institutions are moving to knowledge graphs, because they need that validation. They need that visibility into the kinds of things that they're asserting and they're trying to use factually for business purposes.
Yep. Well, it gets into that data governance, right? That Kurt, you were talking about. If you, not to say a knowledge graph, it's going to fix it, and specifically an ontology based, don't get me wrong, both types of knowledge graphs are valid and useful. However, when you're trying to do data validation and have traceability and observability and business rules and governance on top of things, an ontology is usually a better choice. That's where that's helpful, right? And what I find really alarming, and I'm curious what you both have to say about this. I've run into a lot of people recently now that AI and knowledge graphs are, the best thing since sliced bread. Everyone seems to think right now. Oh yeah, I have a knowledge graph. Great. What's that look like? What was it used for? And then they show me something that was, used for, I don't know, let's say fraud detection. It's like, yeah, but how do you see that being used in your AI to ground it on a source of truth, right? Like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's components in there that you can reuse, but I think that there's this gross understanding right now that any knowledge graph, anyone at all, can be used to help with this AI problem, when in reality, it's not as easy as that, as much as we'd like to say otherwise.
I mean, what is an ontology? And I realize that's a very complicated question, but among other things, an ontology is essentially an agreement. It is something that basically says we are agreeing to these particular rules of reasoning for our particular organization with this particular taxonomy. And these are the ways that we essentially ground the information that we're talking about into a structure where we have a common language for communication. So in and of itself, that's really the purpose of the ontology. The data in that ontology is really almost secondary to the structure.
It helps make the data better.
It helps, obviously, very, very much so. But at the same time, what I see a lot of is that people come in and say, hey, look, I've got a knowledge graph, man. And I'll go back and say, okay, well, is there a structure to it? Well, we kind of did these little things, but it's, just kind of formed from its own, we pulled it from an Excel file. Which, happens far more often than any of us would probably feel comfortable with. But that ontology, if you have a way of basically committing that ontology into a knowledge graph, or into an LLM or other similar system where you can say, these are the rules that you're going to use for being able to do reasoning in this particular context, that's really where the value comes in. That gets complicated partially because I don't think that there are actually very many good knowledge graphs out there. Too many of them tend to be, I'm going to describe the things in my organization without actually thinking about the fact that information evolves. You have time. Temporal aspects become a very important piece, and temporal aspects are hard in knowledge graphs. That's something where I've been doing a lot of work in the last several months with reifications, and how reifications basically are one mechanism for being able to handle versioning data transitions, from one property value to another property value, or things like that. I'm not seeing that in most of the knowledge graphs that I think that are currently in use. They're still tied very much into what are the things in my system, and they haven't got to the notion of evolution. But that in turn, I think, makes it harder when you're trying to go in and say, yeah, you need knowledge graphs, but you also need to take into account time. You need to take into account the fact that information that is current at one point may not be current at another. And that, I think that's really where a lot of that grounding needs to take place. Unfortunately, a lot of the LLMs, we've got a couple of techniques for putting graphs in the system. They're not really very good.
Not really.
We're still struggling. We're still trying to say, how do we rectify this vector-oriented way of thinking with a graph-oriented way of thinking? They're not the same thing.
Yeah. And so comment number one on that is one of my most popular videos on my channel ever since it launched was different ways to version an ontology, because people forget that part, and it's hard. It's really hard.
It is hard.
It's really hard, but so necessary. So that's number one. But then the second one, and Alan, I'm curious about your take on this too, because you were talking about, the digital wasteland and, all these other things that others have talked about over the years. And a comment was made by a very prominent person in the graph space. I won't mention his name. I don't think he would care if I did, but, just because I haven't asked for his permission, was talking about, the real semantic web was, really not about linked data. It wasn't really meant for that. And again, this is my words, not his. This next part, which is, I do kind of think it goes a little bit into that decentralized stuff that we were just mentioning before, where it's not necessarily about creating these databases of linked data, right? And then of course you have like your internal linked data and all of that, but so your internal systems can talk to each other, and you can use agentic systems and blah, 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 blah. But it's also, how do you connect to other people's stuff? And it's not so much about the linked data. It's having, and it's not even about the schema. I'm not even talking the mechanism here, but it's making sure that you can actually share data across boundaries, right? At a high level. And it's like, we're still not there. And also, lots of people don't think we will ever be there. I don't know where I am on that spectrum, but Alan, I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that when people say those kinds of things, you have to put their thinking within the context of, everybody has their own observational bias. So they may know some things, but not other things. But the fact of the matter is that semantic web and semantic technologies and knowledge graphs, the power of them only exists when you're crossing boundaries. And so that's why the financial services vertical has latched onto them. For financial reporting, for example, you've got SBRM, the standard business report model, which starts as a document, a spreadsheet that's a smart spreadsheet. So you're starting foundationally with a semantic basis so that you can make those connections and you can connect these things that should be reusable. they ought to be fair. They ought to be findable, interoperable, accessible, and reusable. So the people who have to work across boundaries for certain purposes are trying to do that. In pharmaceuticals, for example, the big pharma companies are doing drug discovery because they have to cross all these boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
They have to work at the molecular level, so they have to be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
In the DoD, you've got intelligence agencies that are integrating all sorts of data, thousands and thousands of sources. How are they
Usually
going
not
to
very
do
well, but that's a different topic.
Well, but that's what they're. I mean, we've got pockets of adoption of that sort of thing, and that really is underscoring how the technologies that we're enamored of are really working. You've got in the media space, you've got people actually making content accessible in those ways. So as you're well aware of, so I think what we've got, Ashleigh, is like the 1%ers who are doing things in a powerful way, and they're waiting for this critical mass of activity to happen so that they can do more with what they know and really have an impact. And so supply chain is like the next step here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because supply chain, it's a huge problem.
I'm expecting supply chain to be one of the big areas over the course of the next 5 years to really see that, because it's a mess. I mean, precisely because of what Alan's talking about. We're crossing boundaries. We are dealing with multiple systems that essentially have to be able to track information from one boundary to another. We're talking about many different ways of being able to catalog manifests, to be able to talk about how do you effectively identify where a particular resource is. And that process is something that has largely been dominated by a few big players in general that have said, okay, we've established our own system and we're fine with that system, but now they're increasingly at a point where they are now having to interact with other large systems. And it gets back down to, okay, there is a need right there for some kind of ontology. There is a need right there for a mechanism to communicate information at some level. But again, it is something that has to happen, I think, organically. It's not going to be one company dominating everything. There's a few spaces where that's probably true, but increasingly it's okay when you start talking about multiple global players. That ability to talk about information consistently is really the next major. It's the next frontier.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be like this grassroots kind of skunkworks thing. I was actually incredibly lucky, so fortunate that I think I was just taking notes in a meeting. But it was a big meeting. It was a big meeting of all the big telecoms and all the big folks that had data to start to feed IoT in the early days. And all these companies were like, well, IoT crosses many boundaries, and for all of us to succeed, we all need to agree how to play nice with each other. And so this meeting was on neutral territory. It was a standards development organization that got everyone together. And I happily was working at one of those standards orgs. So I was there while this was all happening. And I'm so happy I got to see it in action. So I know it's possible. But they all, like, it was so funny. It was like everyone holding their cards, like, what cards do you have? What do you want to share? What do you have? It was like the craziest thing. But they all ended up having to basically agree on the different types of data that they were willing to share across boundaries, what was okay and secure to do, how to then start the process of sharing and doing all of these things. So it's possible. It just it is a necessity that has to happen from a use case, right? That kind of comes up.
And I'm really big on gen video. I think that if you look at where the immediate returns or the closest thing to immediate returns are in that space, it's probably going to be there. But it also basically is becoming an absolute nightmare from an IP standpoint. And a lot of that really kind of is now getting back to well, what do we do in those situations where we no longer really have the ability or control over our resources? And I think that's ties back into things like the OpenAI world and the whole question about who owns what.
We were talking about agents earlier. I think that agents could be a solution to this kind of issue. And when you listen to Nadella, one of the good things that he was talking about sort of triggered some ideas about how agents could go knocking on the door and saying, can I get access to this? So it solved the data cartel problem in some ways. If all these agents are saying, well, we need access here and here's why, and it's done in a governance-enabled way, then the agents could be at the forefront of getting this access, for example. And then on the IP side of things, there's the whole issue of decentralized ownership and owning your own data. And really, that's where we should have started from. If we could go back to the beginning and start over again, we would start in a decentralized manner, and everybody would own their own data and then just open up what they need to when they need to for the right purpose.
And this was a conversation I had recently on that went fairly deep into that whole question. And the problem basically comes down to the fact that data is essentially an artifact. It is an artifact of some kind of transaction that has occurred, or the creation of some kind of resource or something to that effect. And typically it's not something that is, the concept of data ownership is really slippery once you start getting into the fact that things like medical records, the medical records basically exist not from the standpoint of the individual patient, but from the standpoint of the healthcare system. And that becomes kind of a question of this is information about a person or information about a company, but it's not actually the information that's specifically generated by that person or by that company. And that is really one of the big stumbling blocks in talking about personal data, is that people generally don't generate their own data. I mean,
or know that they have
exceptions. Or know that they have it, even if they do. And even biometric information. Most of that biometric information that you're talking about is essentially information that comes from healthcare systems.
Well, and on that topic, I mean, to dive into that very specific thing for 1 second, your DNA, right? Like there's been breaches and things that we've heard about,
Right.
If you have a sibling and they did it, but you didn't, guess what? Your data is in there because you're siblings, right? So it's getting like really tricky because maybe your sibling gave permission and did those things, but you didn't. But now your DNA is basically out there because you're siblings. You're so close. And, that's another weird thing where, I've heard a lot of people getting upset about this because of that breach happening. And now they're mad because their siblings or their parents decided to do it. It's a fun thing to do around the holidays. But now their DNA of their family, which includes them, is now out there for people.
Well, yeah, and you can't help who you're related to.
Exactly. And you can't get permission from the whole family tree.
No.
What do you do there?
And they might be a serial killer. I mean,
well, and there's that.
Jeffrey Dahmer or something. It's like, I think that there's going to be this negotiation that goes back and forth.
Yeah.
And this ties into the feedback loop that really ought to exist. The human machine feedback loop, and the human should be at the forefront of it, not in the background. And what's disconcerting about what I'm seeing in the press lately about AI has to do with this sort of a dystopian vision that that everybody's going to lose their jobs, and maybe it's right for that to happen, and that there should be autonomous systems instead of people working. Just lots of misguided mentalities out there that aren't incorporating this human first perspective. I think there has to be a much more proactive approach to humanistic AI.
Yeah, and it goes back to like this governance, right? Okay, help me out because I'm trying to remember the guy's name. The one that you ask any chatbot about, they don't know his name anymore because he got.
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, I can't remember the name. But now anybody with that name is not in any of the AI. And it's like, okay, well, you have the right to be forgotten because there are laws and regulations about this across the globe. But if you don't have data governance and you're just using an AI, it doesn't know the unique individual who asked about that. So you can't really do that effectively. And we can see that. We've already seen it. Guy's name, I can't remember.
Yeah, it is. And there's actually a suite of about 10 or 12 names that for some reason have all disappeared down the rabbit hole. As I said in a post today, it's not that I'm worried about AI, it's that I'm worried about the unethical use by people of AI.
Yep.
The reality of AI right now is that it's actually got just a bare toehold in the overall economic systems that we have going. So, the actual impact of AI is probably not going to be seen for another decade, maybe more.
Well, a lot of it has to do with the cost of it, right? Like the cost of running it. So, okay, don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot of untapped potential for everyday folks to use AI for things that they might not even realize they can use it for.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, okay, let's say I have a bucket load of emails, just tons. And this time of year, it's always nice to go through and clean out your inbox if you have the appetite, because I certainly don't. But why not get an AI to do it for you? But it's like, okay, but if you calculate the amount, now it's great for me because I don't have to do it. And it's, not something maybe worth my time doing. But then if you think about the cost of running that, I mean, maybe it's still not consequential, but if we're all doing it, is it really worth that? Or is it okay for those emails to just drop off into nowhere land like they've always done? Like there's that cost benefit analysis and whether it's even worth doing.
There is. And I think that there's this notion of how many people are actually going to work toward a good solution to those problems. Are we going to get the AI we want or not? And if you think about this from an adoption perspective, because I look at adoption a lot, and you look at enterprises, there's the 80-20 rule that applies to enterprises. 80% really don't pay much attention to their IT. They hand it off to somebody else. It was Nick Carr's old mentality from the 2000s. IT doesn't matter. We're just going to pay third parties to do what they do, and we're going to trust that they do it. Only 20% are proactive about their IT. And then when it comes to actually doing the right thing proactively, there may only be 1% of enterprises that actually are starting to do the right thing. So I think that as a community, we need to take a leadership role and really just make it, we have to punch above our own weight, because otherwise it's not going to get beyond that 1% of adoption that we currently have in pushing data modeling, ontologies, semantic metadata, and the whole data-centric management of things toward the direction it needs to be in. So we get the kind of AI that we want, and we have the rights that we need, and it's not handed off to some oligarchy that has some different vision that doesn't square with our values.
Well, and we're primed to do it, right? Like we keep hearing, and more research is coming out, even outside of the knowledge graph community, that hey, knowledge graphs are really, really useful, if not completely, it's super necessary to have when you're doing anything with AI. Off camera here, before we started, we were talking. Meta just today or yesterday released that they are using a concept based AI, which is knowledge graph based. What else is a concept? And it's all semantics, right? So weird. Why do they keep calling it things that it's not, or like making up new words? It drives me nuts when people do that. And then we already know there are other LLM providers that have already come out saying that they are using knowledge graphs in some capacity for what they're doing. Even if you're not doing knowledge graph, Anthropic came out with, what was that thing called? DPE or something. It was a few weeks ago, where it's like, hey, it's a common schema so that you can like get your data to interact with your LLM. I'm like, why are we pretending it's not semantics? What is wrong with this? Right? But all of this to say, like, it's happening and we all know how it's working. So, I think I think we're primed, Alan. I don't know if we're doing it yet.
Yeah.
If I can jump in on that, I
Please.
think there's a couple of factors that play into that. First of all, that there is the not invented here syndrome. Right now, the neural network community is in the driver's seat, and they don't want to see this notion of saying, well, you have to have structure, you have to have something that can't be ascertained from a neural network, because it basically undercuts the whole argument that everything can be done by a computer. And that's not saying that you can't design an ontology. I do it all the time. I'm sure both of you do as well, where you basically say, okay, I need to put together an ontology. I'll sit there with something like Claude or OpenAI, usually Claude. It's got a better processor. But I'll sit there and I'll basically use it to kind of bounce ideas off about, how do you basically structure this ontology to be able to facilitate what you need.
Good clay on the table.
Yeah, it works, but that's a little bit different than basically saying, okay, we can basically import a lot of data and magically we're going to see these ontologies emerge. And that doesn't happen because that's not the way it works. No. It's not the way that the information systems are set up. It's not the way that vector-based systems work. They can't do that. You have to have a labeler somewhere in the system.
And a shared understanding. The one that I'm saying this to the audience too. If you need a way to punch a hole in that logic, ask what is a customer, how it's defined. Done. God, yeah. Fix. It's not going to do it. It's not going to define how you as an organization do it. So there you go. It's how you break a hole in it.
Yeah, exactly. But there's going to be people. That's a part of the problem, I think, is that we're seeing people trying to use these language models to essentially generate information that ultimately needs to be human directed. And I think that's the argument that we all have all been trying to make for the last 3 years, of saying, look, it's not just this matter of saying, it's a faster, cheaper, more efficient way of being able to get the information you need. It's the fact that it is a contract. Mm-hmm. It is basically a standard that you are going in and saying, this is the shape of my data. And without that in place, what you're going to get is going to be different from iteration to iteration, and you can't build on that.
Yeah.
And, that's the argument that I've been trying to make for a while now. And it's something that I think is finally beginning to percolate in people's heads that, okay, well, maybe you do need some kind of structure, because otherwise what you end up with is something where it'll give you very elegant solutions, but they'll be different every time.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with you, but I take a little nuance on one part, which is, and I'll put a caveat on that one part because it can be dangerous if not put on as a caveat. And that is, I actually do like suggesting people to go and look at GraphRag, Not because I think that it's going to solve all their problems, and not because I think that it's going to work in production. It's because I feel like there's so many people that are intimidated by just getting into graph at all, that it's a great way of just saying, bloop, let's see what it does. It gets that inquisitiveness, it gets that excitement. It's like, oh, that's interesting. And it starts that conversation, right? And experimentation. So I do like that. But the caveat to it, which is, I also know when left to their own devices, without this caveat, people will then try to use this in production. And what ends up happening is, and I can tell you case study after case study after case study, it takes more time, way more time, to go in and fix a ontology created by an AI than making it from scratch. So maybe you don't have an ontologist on staff. Maybe you just need to prove out a small use case. Okay, then go experiment, go try GraphRag. But just know, long term, it's not going to be the fix that you think.
Yep, I would agree with that. I think that it's GraphRag was basically a solution to a problem. Mm-hmm. And that problem was that if you look at the way that LLMs work, they are essentially designed for a very shallow ontology. There is, because language itself has a certain level of intrinsic structure. But when you basically parse it down and turn it into chunks, then what happens with that is that structure becomes extraordinarily shallow. Doing any kind of logical analysis on it is very difficult. Mm-hmm. And realistically, even with that, when you start talking about the way that you build out context chains, those context chains have to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And that in turn basically affects the efficiency of the system. We still don't have the concept of true memorization, of true memory allocation.
Oh, apparently somebody had just invented a memory LLM. I don't know. I saw something.
Oh yeah, I mean they're out there, but to be honest, how effective are they?
To borrow Alan's, is it there? Is it really
yeah, I don't think it's even here there.
Alan, I'm going to keep using that. Now you know it's an homage of you when I do this in videos.
Well, it goes back to Gertrude Stein. Talking about Oakland, there is no there.
Yes.
Getting off a little bit off the topic of, the ontology space, but kind of in the same vein of, well, you can't totally get rid of the people part, which I think a lot of folks are trying to do. Which again, I'm not saying, preserve all manual processes. I don't think anybody actually wants that, including the people that have to do those manual processes. But it kind of and I don't know if we want to touch this or not, but, this whole return to office thing. So we were talking about, because this, I think it kind of goes, there's some stuff going on between these two spaces, right? So Alan, you were talking about the 80-20 rule, right? Well, they're saying there's, this 80-20 rule with people that actually, see higher productivity versus not. And there's conflicting evidence as whether being in the office or not, is more productive and whatnot. And believe me, there's a million ways to measure productivity. It depends on your job, depends on your organization. There's a lot of dependencies on these claims that are made out there. But one thing that I do think about is, the one of the studies I saw said that those that come into the office have 10% increase in productivity. And I thought to myself, well, I'm sure there's lots of reasons for that. But in my mind, I just think about my own work. And I think, if you're stuck in an office and you can't go anywhere and you can't, take your dog for a walk and clear your head to think about a problem, which apparently is why you're supposed to go into the office. But honestly, there's plenty of psychological studies saying if you don't stop staring at a screen after so long, your productivity and your mindset goes down. So there's that. And I'm not talking an hour. I'm saying 5 minutes, go outside, see a bird, come back in. Maybe you're going to be a better person. But, if you can't do that and you're stuck, what's that productivity of 10%? Is it you manually going in and cleaning your emails out? Are you, answering a bunch of emails with yes, no, maybe so's? Are you like all of these little manual like things that we all do during the day? And I just wonder, is that maybe where AI can be helpful, where like all those weird like manual things that you don't necessarily need to do that are giving the productivity boost, but it's really not productivity that's useful. Productivity just means you're busy doing something. That doesn't mean you're actually moving the needle on anything. There's plenty of organizations that see activity as progress when it's not true.
Yeah, and I don't know who's doing the measuring or what their assumptions are.
I know there's one from Stanford. There's one from, I think, MIT, maybe. There's a bunch out there.
I'm sure, but they're getting at something. But let me just sort of step back and think about the bigger picture here a little bit. People learn in different ways, and they're optimized in different ways, and there are elements to an in-office dynamic that I personally like. When I was at PwC, just being able to brainstorm with people who were next door or down the hall or on a different floor, that was a great thing. The fact that they were available, sometimes you'd catch them, during the Christmas break, because they would be in the office so that nobody would bother them.
But you were bothering them. Well, because you went to talk to them.
Right, but I was just getting a few moments of their time. They were able to do what they needed to do. I think that, personally, the way I work is I need to do the things that you're talking about. Go outside for a walk, sleep on it overnight. Mm-hmm. In the morning, I have ideas that I didn't have last night. I can complete what I tried to do yesterday. If I tried to struggle and finish it the day before, it wouldn't have been as good. So there's a hybrid approach that works for me. Others might not benefit from it as much. So basically, this one size fits all. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's an assumption in what you're saying, too, that you just described everyone being co-located, which is not always in fact, it's very rarely possible.
Yeah, right.
In a lot of big companies. But what I've seen is this creates a tension on teams. And I do wonder, maybe this isn't a person problem, it's a team problem. Meaning, I think a lot of people have kind of come down saying like, well, it really should be up to the team. The team that you're on, if you do better working together and the type of work you do is working together, or if you are doing mostly like individual research or article writing or something, maybe you don't need to be, and it can be determined at a team level. But even then, there's a tension sometimes where if you're the only one on the team that doesn't want to go in, you feel pressured to do so. And then it doesn't work for the way that you work. And, we could all say, well, yeah, actually, but 5 years ago, we all had to go into the office. It's like, yeah, but now we know there's a different type of life. And that's the problem. We all kind of know what it looks like now. And it's like, well, Pandora box open. So I do wonder if it's maybe a restructuring of teams where, and this goes to a different problem where it's like everybody is so niche and pigeonholed into what they do at a job that it's hard to mix and match teams.
Absolutely. And I think that this concept of a meta organization, a layer above the formal organization, it really helps out. And basically, I think the graph approach to this is sort of a metaphor for how this could work in human organizations, where you've got this boundary crossing going on. You might have the formal org chart, but I never work through the formal org chart to get things done. You have to build informal relationships with people who know what you need to know, and who can give you what you need to finish a project. So you're crossing those boundaries yourself manually. Why can't the system help you cross those boundaries and get those problems solved? It's all about problem solving in these feedback loops we're trying to create. And I just wish paradigm sort of lent itself to that kind of working.
I think that's happening to a certain extent. We're still basically talking about networks. It's just that we're changing that network. There's always been, and again, articles that I've written on this. There's always been this notion of saying, okay, we have a hierarchical network that basically describes an organization. And that is something that we tend to naturally fall into because human beings tend to prefer hierarchies. That's always been true. But there's also that intra-nodal communication that you have that is essential, which is essential to organizations. That has to be there, that essentially acts as these cross connections, going from here is essentially a single transitive closure to here is something that is basically rich and diverse, and there's all kinds of different kinds of connections that connect us one to another. And I think that what's happening now is that we're beginning to test those boundaries. We're beginning to basically start realizing that an organization is not an org chart. It is something that usually is much more loose and solid. And people like us, people that are ontologists, that are architects, that are essentially used to being able to go to the CEO and to the programmer, and to the marketing person, people that work within that organization, cross boundaries, are more obviously aware of what's going on and see that more than people who basically are still thinking in terms of, who do I report to, who reports to me.
That's a good point. The data modelers, because you have to touch so many areas of the organization, probably would be kind of center nodes, so to speak, in that network. Never thought of it that way.
They're the sergeants of the world. The sergeants of the
generals, depending.
Not
the generals.
In the Navy, it would be the chief petty officers,
or the CPOs. Yes,
things done. Yeah. It's just sort of working across the departments to get things done.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those CPOs, you're screwed.
Yeah.
I've never seen. I've never seen an organization. I was in the Navy myself. But I've never seen an organization where if you didn't have those people that essentially are communicating between boundaries,
the dot connectors,
then your organization is going to fall apart because they're just the information flow is no longer there that needs to be there. That's cohesive. It's just that it's been largely invisible because those dot connectors are often not seen in the charts themselves.
Well, I think it's also there's seasons of life too, right? Like there's a lot of people that will say, well, those that are just out of school really need a lot of mentorship, and being in the office is very critical to that. Yeah. But again, I just look at my own teenager and the other teenagers that I know, and I'm like, their entire lives are online. They don't even hang out in real life anymore. So what's that? I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think that's right, but that's just their third place is wherever they are online. So what does that look like for the newer generations that are coming through? Are they going to be interested in mentorship in person? Again, this is a gross over, blanketing statement, so I don't mean it that way. But a lot of teenagers that I know don't even know how to actually talk to people in real life. My daughter is great, actually. I heard her on the phone, and I'm like, you sounded like professional. That's amazing. Where did you learn that? Right? So not all are like that. But that makes me think. And for people that, you also hear this is affecting women a lot, that also happen to be caregivers, whether they're elderly care, child care, whatever it might be. It's not always women either. I mean, the men that are doing that too, but it's one of those things where, okay, maybe for that moment, that season in your life, you have to have hybrid or you have to have fully remote, but that's not actually what you want. That's just what you need for that moment. So yeah, I mean, it keeps coming back to then what's the answer? And the answer is don't mandate everybody to go in. that's what my that's what it is. All right, and thank you all for listening in. If any of this has created a eureka moment, or if we've missed anything, make sure you leave it down in the comments below. And so with that, I want to thank you very much, and I'll catch you next time.